Power has many faces. Sometimes it wears a badge, sometimes it signs a contract, and sometimes it hides behind a polished desk, miles away from the blood that it commands. Last time, we walked through the front door of the house, the monopoly that ruled Lincoln County like a kingdom. We met its builders and enforcers, Murphy, Dolan, Riley, and the gangs who turned their greed into gunfire. But behind the smoke and the shootouts, there were men whose names never echoed through the streets of Lincoln because they never had to draw a gun to win. This is the story of the Santa Fe Ring, the unseen hand that shaped the fate of New Mexico. It wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. No rustlers, no stagecoach robbers, no gunfighters riding under the desert sun. These were lawyers, judges, bankers, and politicians who ruled through paper instead of pistols. While Billy the Kid and the regulators fought and died in the dust, the men in Santa Fe and Washington, D.C. moved the chess pieces. The ring's influence reached everywhere. Land grants, military contracts, even the very law itself. And at the center of it all stood Thomas B. Catron, a man who turned land into power and power into law. He didn't need to pull a trigger. He just needed his signature. Tonight, we'll peel back the curtain on the true architects of the Lincoln County War, the generals who stood by, the politicians who profited, and the businessmen who built fortunes while entire towns burned. These were the men who made the rules, and the ones who decided who lived long enough to break them. Because in Lincoln County, the guns made headlines, but the power was written in ink.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Good to kind of be back here doing our thing. And
got my bear.
Hopefully you got your bear.
Got my bear.
Hopefully we can have some kind of consistency now, but I make no promises. I take it one day at a time because that's just how it comes.
Wondering how long I can hug the bear before you don't take me seriously anymore.
Oh, I stopped taking you seriously a while ago.
Years ago.
So
Years ago.
you're safe.
All right, I'm good.
That ship sailed a while ago. So,
It's good to know.
welcome back, listeners, to Gallows and Gunfights, where we put the Old West on trial and let history decide who walks free and who swings. Last time, we walked through the front door of the house, the empire that ruled Lincoln County. Tonight, we follow the money, the power, and the politics that made it all possible.
Can we barrel through the saloon doors of the house? That sounds more fun.
Yeah, that's kind of, a lot more theatrical, for sure.
I dig that a
Okay,
lot.
let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. If you haven't already, take a second to give this episode a thumbs up, follow the show, and leave us a review. It might not seem like much, but it helps keep these stories alive and helps new listeners find their way to the gallows.
We're heading past the gunslingers now, into the halls of politics and profit, where signatures carried more weight than six-shooters, the Santa Fe Ring, the power brokers, and the soldiers who stood by as Lincoln County burned.
And remember, you can follow Dark Dialogue, Gallows and Gunfights across every major podcast platform and on social media. Like, share, review, and tell a friend who loves true Western history. This is where the facts ride hard and the guilty never hide.
Because out here, every legend stands trial, and the truth doesn't care how powerful your friends were.
This is Gallows and Gunfights, Episode 4, The Hand That Pulled the Strings.
So Lincoln County may have been a battlefield, but the war wasn't really born there. Its roots stretch far beyond the dusty streets, reaching into the marble offices and mahogany desks of Santa Fe, where power didn't ride on horseback. It walked on polished floors. While men like Murphy, Dolan, and Riley ran the house with ledgers and rifles, their strings were being pulled from a much higher place. Up north, behind the veils of politics and privilege, the real empire of the Southwest was being built. An empire made of paper, law, and land. They called it the Santa Fe Ring. It wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. There were no badges, no brands, no outlaw hideouts in the hills. These were men of letters, lawyers, politicians, bankers, and judges who operated like a criminal syndicate under the banner of legitimacy. They shaped the courts, fixed the contracts, and wrote the laws that made them untouchable. To them, Lincoln County wasn't chaos, it was business. Every bullet fired, every ranch burned, every man hanged in the name of order. It all traced back to profit and power funneled into the ring's hands. And at the heart of it all stood one man. The face of law and corruption rolled into one. He was no gunfighter, no rancher, no killer. He didn't need to be. He had a seal, a title, and a pen that carried more weight than any six-shooter in the territory. His name was Thomas Benton Catron. He wasn't the man who started the Lincoln County War, but he's one of the reasons it never truly ended.
Sounds like you'd have an alcohol named after him.
It kind of does,
Much
huh?
like Patron.
Thomas B. Catron.
Sorry.
Probably a tequila.
Let me jump right into your... Yeah.
The charge? Political corruption, manipulation of law, and the creation of an empire built not on gunpowder, but on ink. Thomas Benton Catron was one of the most powerful figures in the late 19th century New Mexico territory, an attorney, a politician, and the undisputed architect of the Santa Fe Ring, the invisible hand that controlled the territory's courts, land, and power. While the men of the House fought over Lincoln County with rifles and ledgers, Catron was fighting a different kind of war. One waged in courtrooms and Capitol halls, fought not with bullets but with signatures. Born in Missouri in 1840, Catron served as a Confederate officer during the Civil War before drifting west to New Mexico, where opportunity came not from cattle or mining, but from chaos. The end of the war had left land ownership across the territory tangled in the remnants of Mexican and Spanish land grants. Where others saw confusion, Catron saw profit. He began quietly buying up questionable claims, exploiting legal gray areas to amass a fortune in property. His mastery of land law turned him into one of the most feared and influential men in the region. By the 1870s, he owned more of New Mexico than most towns combined. And what he didn't own, he often controlled through mortgages or legal manipulation. The Santa Fe Ring wasn't an official organization. It was a syndicate, a network of lawyers, judges, bankers, and politicians who worked together to dominate the territory's legal and economic system. Among its ranks were names that echoed through territorial history: Governor Samuel B. Axtell, Judge Warren Bristol, and District Attorney William Rynerson, among others. Together, they ensured that justice served those who could afford it and buried those that couldn't. Their reach was absolute. Elections could be decided with a handshake. Court verdicts could be bought with a favor, and entire towns could rise or fall on the weight of one man's legal pen. In Lincoln County, that influence took physical form through the House. Catron was its financier, its protector, and through his brother-in-law, Edgar Walls, its accountant on the ground. When Murphy and Dolan's monopoly came under threat, Walls was sent from Santa Fe to stabilize the books, safeguard the mortgages, and make sure Catron's investments survived the storm. The ring's interests were woven directly into the conflict. Behind every gunman on the street was a lawyer in Santa Fe ensuring that nothing interrupted the flow of profit. By the time the shooting stopped, Catron's empire had grown even stronger. While Billy the Kid's name became legend and Murphy's store fell to ash, Catron emerged untouched, richer, more connected, and more powerful than ever. He went on to serve as New Mexico's territorial attorney general, district attorney, and eventually one of the first U.S. senators after statehood in 1912. At the height of his power, Catron personally owned or controlled over 3 million acres of New Mexico land. Much of it wrestled away through courtroom battles and legislative trickery. The frontier's gunfighters might have faded, but Catron's kind of power would shape the Southwest for generations. The verdict of time? Thomas B. Catron stands as the ultimate transformation of the outlaw spirit. Where others drew guns, he drew contracts. Where others seized cattle, he seized counties. He didn't need to kill to conquer. He just needed a desk, a seal, and the patience to turn corruption into policy. The jury of history finds him guilty, not of violence, but of something far more enduring. The invention of systemic control. His Santa Fe ring proved that power on the frontier didn't disappear when the guns went silent. It just changed wardrobe and learned how to legislate. Power, when it takes root, needs more than money. It needs legitimacy. The Santa Fe ring had its lawyers, its bankers, its enforcers, but every empire of corruption needs one thing more than all the rest: a friendly government. That's where Samuel Beach Axtell came in. He wasn't born in the desert or the saddle. Axtell was a politician, a man who could dress corruption in formality and call it governance. While Catron wrote the rules, Axtell enforced them from the governor's chair, turning the law into a shield for the House and a sword against its enemies. When Lincoln County began to burn, Axtell didn't rush to stop the fire. He made sure that it burned in the right direction. As the regulators fought and died in the dust, the governor of New Mexico sat hundreds of miles away in Santa Fe, signing orders, issuing decrees, and quietly ensuring that the power behind the House stayed untouchable. This wasn't a gunfight, it was policy, and Samuel B. Axtell was the man who made injustice official. The charge? Abuse of power, political collusion, and transforming the governor's office into a weapon for the House. Samuel Beach Axtell was one of the most controversial governors ever to hold office in the New Mexico Territory, a man whose charisma and cunning made him both a statesman and an accomplice. His rule blurred the line between politics and organized corruption, and his actions during the Lincoln County War made him one of the House's most powerful allies. Born in New York in 1819, Axtell came of age in a country on the move. He trained as a lawyer before heading west during the California Gold Rush, where he learned how politics could be mined for profit, just as easily as silver and gold. In the rough and tumble politics of frontier California, Axtell built a name for himself, quick with words, quick with deals, and quicker still to side with whoever could advance his career. He served as a U.S. congressman from California between 1867 and 1871, developing a talent for reading rooms and bending rules. When President Ulysses S. Grant appointed him territorial governor of New Mexico in 1875, Axtell stepped into the land already carved up by the influence. To the east, ranchers battled rustlers and rival traders. To the north, lawyers and politicians in Santa Fe quietly drew the borders of an empire, the Santa Fe Ring, led by Thomas B. Catron. It didn't take long for Axtell to find his place among them. Catron had the land, Murphy and Dolan had the money, and Axtell, he had the seal of government. From the moment he arrived, Axtell governed less like an impartial leader and more like a corporate executive. He used his power to reward loyalty, crush dissent, and keep the ring's machinery running smoothly. When the Lincoln County War erupted in 1878, Axtell didn't just look the other way. He picked a side. He dismissed local officials sympathetic to Tunstall and McSween, the rivals of the House, and replaced them with men loyal to Murphy and Dolan. He stripped the justice of the peace of his authority and invalidated legal writs that threatened his allies' grip on power. Deputies aligned with the House were granted legitimacy, while those who opposed them were branded as outlaws. In short, Governor Axtell turned the territorial government into a weapon of monopoly. His office became the political shield for the very men whose greed had ignited the war. Reports spread quickly, claims of favoritism, graft, and official blindness to murder. Federal authorities began asking questions, but Axtell stayed loyal to his benefactors, even authorizing military intervention under the guise of restoring order. What that really meant was protecting the House's financial interests while Lincoln County bled. By mid 1878, his political empire began to crack. The violence in Lincoln drew headlines from coast to coast, and Washington could no longer ignore the chaos. President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered an investigation, and soon after, Axtell was suspended from office, replaced by Lew Wallace, who inherited a territory poisoned by corruption and bloodshed. Axtell didn't leave New Mexico. He pivoted, returning to law, then later becoming a territorial judge. In that role, he tried to redeem himself, earning cautious respect for his sharp mind and legal skill. But his name would forever be linked to one of the darkest chapters in the territory's history. The verdict of time? Governor Samuel Beach Axtell stands guilty of turning the governor's seal into a license for corruption. He wasn't a killer in the traditional sense, but the lives lost in Lincoln County were casualties of his political convenience. He served law and order only when it suited power and turned a civil office into a cornerstone of collusion. Yet history rarely paints his villainous in one color. Axtell was brilliant, ambitious, and at times capable of true reform. But like many men of the frontier elite, his legacy was built on compromise, not on courage. In the record of New Mexico's history, Axtell's name remains a warning that on the frontier, justice could wear the mask of law and corruption could sit comfortably in the governor's chair. When power needs protection, it turns to the courts. And in the New Mexico territory, that meant one man, Judge Warren Bristol. If Thomas Catron wrote the laws and Governor Axtell enforced them, Bristol was the man who made sure justice spoke in the right direction. From his bench, he didn't just interpret the law, he defined who it applied to. During the Lincoln County War, Bristol's courtroom wasn't a place of order. It was a stage, and every verdict had a price. Under his watch, the Santa Fe Ring's influence reached its most refined form, legal rulings that turned corruption into legitimacy. The regulators could be hunted as outlaws, while the men who burned Lincoln to the ground walked free in suits and sashes. Warren Bristol's court wasn't blind. It just refused to look down. Next, we enter the halls of justice, where verdicts were bought, witnesses vanished, and the gavel echoed not with fairness, but with fear. The charge? Subverting justice to serve the powerful, using the courtroom as the quietest weapon of the Santa Fe Ring. Judge Warren H. Bristol wasn't the type of man who ruled through fear or through gunfire. He didn't need to. His authority came from the one thing every outlaw and lawman feared, the gavel. As Chief Justice of New Mexico's Territorial Supreme Court, Bristol's courtroom became the final frontier of the Lincoln County War, the place where bloodshed of the plains was dressed up in legal robes and declared righteous. Born in Rochester, New York in 1835, Bristol followed the traditional path of ambition: law school in Wisconsin, westward expansion, and political appointment. But when he arrived in New Mexico, he stepped into a world where justice was less about principle and more about control. The territorial's legal system was already entangled in the web of the Santa Fe Ring, and Bristol didn't fight it. He joined it. In 1875, he was appointed Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court, a position of immense influence. Intelligent, methodical, and unflappable, Bristol was respected for his composure, but that calm hid a man willing to bend justice to serve the system that had elevated him. To Bristol, the law wasn't blind, it was obedient. When Lincoln County erupted into war, Bristol's courtroom became the Ring's fortress. He upheld rulings that legitimized the House, Murphy, Dolan, and Riley, and nullified challenges from reformers like Alexander McSween and the regulators who fought under Billy the Kid's banner. The House's deputies, many of them killers and rustlers, were shielded by Bristol's decisions, while their enemies were hunted under warrants that carried his approval. The courtroom was his weapon, and his verdicts did what bullets could not do. They made corruption legal. By the time Governor Lew Wallace arrived to restore order after Samuel Axtell's removal, he found Judge Bristol immovable, a man whose loyalty to the ring was as unyielding as the adobe courthouse walls. Wallace needed reform. Bristol provided resistance. The two men represented opposing visions of law, one for justice, the other for control. But it was Bristol's role in 1881 that forever tied his name to legend. In his courtroom, Billy the Kid, the most infamous symbol of rebellion the ring had ever faced, was tried and convicted for the murder of Sheriff William Brady, a loyal man of the house. Bristol presided with cold precision as the sentence was delivered: death by hanging. That verdict was more than a punishment. It was a statement. It said that rebellion was over, that the regulators' uprising had failed, and that no matter who rode against the house, the law, Bristol's law, would always prevail. To the public, Warren Bristol was every inch the gentleman judge, calm, articulate, neatly dressed, and unfailingly polite, but his restraint made him all the more dangerous. His court was not a place for fairness. It was a stage where power played by its own rules. He ruled consistently in favor of territorial elites, dismissing claims brought by poor settlers and Mexican landholders against Santa Fe ring properties. His judgments read like endorsements of hierarchy, not justice. In an era when the gun could be bought, the law could too, and Bristol ensured that its price never came cheap. Bristol continued to serve as judge long after the smoke cleared from Lincoln County. To some, he was the symbol of order finally returning to the territory. To others, he was proof that corruption didn't die when the shooting stopped. It simply took a seat behind the bench. He died in 1890, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most polarizing figures in New Mexico's territorial history. His courtroom gave the House its final victory and cemented the Santa Fe ring's grip on power for another generation. The verdict of time? Judge Warren H. Bristol stands guilty of silencing justice beneath the weight of respectability. He was not a tyrant in uniform or a villain in the street, but something far more dangerous: the illusion of fairness in a world built on corruption. In a land where bullets once dictated power, Bristol proved that the quiet sound of a gavel could echo louder than any gunshot. Justice in New Mexico didn't end at the judge's bench. It carried on in the man who wrote the charges, shaped the trials, and decided who the law would pursue and who it quietly forgot. If Judge Warren Bristol gave the Santa Fe ring its voice of authority, District Attorney William Rynerson gave it teeth. Rynerson was the kind of prosecutor who didn't need to chase outlaws through the desert. He could destroy them with a paragraph. He understood that in a land run by influence, justice wasn't a matter of guilt or innocence. It was a matter of paperwork. When the Lincoln County War tore through the territory, Rynerson's office didn't seek truth. It sought control. Every indictment, every warrant, every conveniently timed delay served the same master, the ring. He was the unseen enforcer, making sure that the House's enemies faced the full weight of the law, while its allies never saw the inside of a cell. Next, we open the prosecutor's ledger, the place where power was written into law, and law became just another weapon. The charge? Weaponizing justice, silencing truth, and turning the law into a shield for corruption. William Breeden Rynerson wasn't a gunfighter, a rancher, or a politician who commanded crowds. He was something far more dangerous in the New Mexico territory, a prosecutor who understood that the law itself could be turned into a weapon. As district attorney during the Lincoln County War, Rynerson became the Santa Fe ring's most efficient instrument of control. He didn't need to bribe juries or falsify records. He just had to decide which cases would be seen, which would be buried, and who the law would choose to remember. Born in Kentucky in 1838, Rynerson came west like so many others, with ambition in his heart and calculation in his eyes. He studied law, mastered procedure, and learned quickly that in the frontier's chaos, power belonged to the man who could interpret the rules. When he arrived in New Mexico, he found kindred spirits in Thomas B. Catron, Governor Samuel Beach Axtell, and Judge Warren Bristol, men who understood that control of the courts meant control of everything. Rynerson's role in the Santa Fe ring was simple and devastating. He decided who was guilty before the trial ever began. He prosecuted enemies of the House and shielded its allies, twisting territorial statutes into tools of profit and punishment. His cold precision in court and mastery of manipulation earned him both fear and respect, and ensured that the House could operate without consequence. When rancher John Tunstall was murdered by deputies loyal to the Murphy-Dolan faction, Rynerson refused to bring charges against them. But when Tunstall's friends and employees, known as the regulators, retaliated, he branded them outlaws. With a few signatures, he reversed right and wrong, turning victims into fugitives and murderers into lawmen. Every indictment he filed, every warrant he signed, was another nail in the coffin of fairness, and through him, the Santa Fe ring's power became self-perpetuating. Even after the shooting stopped, Rynerson's reach didn't end. When Billy the Kid was finally brought before Judge Bristol for the murder of Sheriff William Brady, a House loyalist, it was Rynerson's machine that made sure the verdict fell the way that the ring intended. Billy's hanging wasn't just retribution for killing, it was a warning that no one defied the system and lived to tell about it. But Rynerson's corruption wasn't confined to Lincoln County. His arrogance and volatility followed him throughout his career. In 1882, in one of the most brazen acts of political violence in territorial history, he shot and killed his rival, Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain, inside the Capitol building in Santa Fe. There were witnesses, there was evidence, and there was no justice. Rynerson was acquitted, his ring allies closing ranks once again to protect their own. William Rynerson's name has become synonymous with corruption of New Mexico's frontier government, a man who made justice transactional and the courtroom a crime scene. To his allies, he was brilliant, decisive, indispensable. To everyone else, he was the face of tyranny in a three-piece suit. He didn't swing a hammer or light a match, but his decisions set fires across the territory that took years to extinguish. Even his death in 1916 couldn't bury the legacy that he left behind, a legacy of fear, manipulation, and the quiet assurance that law and power were never meant to be separate. The verdict of time? William Rynerson stands guilty of betraying the very oath that he swore to uphold. He didn't corrupt justice, he perfected its corruption. In a land scarred by violence, he proved that the deadliest killers were not the men with guns, but the men who decided what was lawful. Law had its enforcers. Politics had its puppeteers. But when the flames of Lincoln County spread beyond control, the ring needed something else. Someone who could give their cause the weight of military authority. That man was Colonel Nathan Dudley. He wore the uniform of the United States Army, carried himself with discipline, and claimed to stand for order. But in the eyes of many, his loyalty wasn't to the flag, it was to the House. As commanding officer of Fort Stanton, Dudley's decisions and his refusals became turning points in the Lincoln County War. He had the power to stop the bloodshed, to protect the innocent, and to enforce neutrality. Instead, his troops stood down when gunfire erupted and rode in only when it was time to save the wrong side. To the ring, he was a guardian. To everybody else, he was the army in name and the house in spirit. Next, we step into the parade ground of Fort Stanton, where orders blurred politics and soldiers' silence became the deadliest strategy of all. The charge? Dereliction of duty, complicity through inaction, and transforming the authority of the U.S. Army into the quiet ally of corruption. Colonel Nathan Augustus Manlove Dudley. There's a freaking name for him.
There's a name.
Colonel Nathan Augustus Manlove Dudley was a soldier through and through, a career officer whose service stretched from the Mexican-American War to the farthest frontiers of the American West. But in the crucible of the Lincoln County War, he became something else entirely, a symbol of what happens when discipline meets politics and loyalty becomes selective. Born in Massachusetts in 1825, Dudley joined the Army at 21, fighting in wars that helped define a young nation's borders. His record was long, his courage proven, his devotion unquestioned. By the 1870s, he was a decorated officer with a reputation for iron discipline, a man who believed in command, obedience, and the sanctity of order. And it was that very faith and hierarchy that made him dangerous in the wrong war. When he assumed command of Fort Stanton, New Mexico, he entered a world unlike any battlefield that he'd ever known. Lincoln County wasn't a war zone of nations. It was a war zone of greed. Ranchers, merchants, and politicians were locked in a struggle, not for territory, but for control of trade, law, and survival itself. In the Santa Fe Ring, the shadow government behind much of the territory was watching closely. When violence erupted between the House, the Murphy-Dolan-Riley monopoly, and the rival Tunstall-McSween faction, Dudley's orders were clear: remain neutral, enforce peace, and protect civilians. But neutrality proved to be a word without meaning. Dudley's sympathies leaned towards the House. Its merchants supplied his fort, its leaders dined at his table, and its influence shaped every political decision within the county. Reports circulated that he allowed Seven Rivers warriors and other Dolan-aligned gunmen to enter Fort Stanton freely, to rest, rearm, or simply hide under the Army's flag. Meanwhile, McSween's men, the regulators, were branded as outlaws. He was supposed to be the impartial hand of federal authority. Instead, he became the quiet muscle of monopoly. Dudley's defining moment came in July of 1878 during the 5-day Battle of Lincoln, the war's brutal and fiery climax. The town was under siege, McSween's home surrounded and burning, his allies trapped inside by Dolan's men. When Dudley rode in with his cavalry, the townspeople believed salvation had arrived, but it didn't. His troops took position at the edge of town. They did not fire. They did not intervene. And when the smoke cleared, McSween was dead, shot while trying to flee his burning house. The Army hadn't ended the fight. It had simply watched it happen. So, not quite as it went down in Young Guns when the Army actually took Alexander McSween out with a Gatling gun, but the guy's still a total pile of shit. So, in the aftermath, Congress launched an investigation into Dudley's conduct. Witnesses accused him of aiding the House, of allowing soldiers to provide cover for Dolan's gang, and of refusing to protect civilians. But in the maze of political connections that defined the Santa Fe Ring, accountability was a dead end. He was cleared on a technicality. His orders, it was said, had been ambiguous. Yet no ambiguity clouded public opinion. To settlers, Dudley was the soldier who stood still, the officer who let justice burn while flying the flag of neutrality. To the Santa Fe Ring, he was the perfect officer, loyal, compliant, and bound by the chain of command to a system that he didn't dare question. Colonel Nathan Dudley retired in 1889, buried later with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. A soldier who, on paper, had done his duty, but history's ledger tells a very different story. He was not a villain by malice, but by omission, a man who mistook restraint for righteousness, who confused obedience with justice. In Lincoln County, that confusion cost lives and ensured the victory of corruption over conscience. The verdict of time? Colonel Nathan Dudley stands guilty, not for firing the wrong shots, but for refusing to fire at all. He proved that even the finest uniform can conceal compromise, and that silence in the face of injustice can be its own kind of treason. When the guns of Lincoln County finally went silent, the smoke didn't clear. It just settled. The house still stood. The regulators were scattered. Their graves outnumbered the victors. And what passed for peace was little more than exhaustion. New Mexico Territory was a land on trial. The people had lost faith in their leaders. The courts had become theaters of control. The army had shown neutrality could be as deadly as war. Something or someone had to restore order. Someone who wasn't owned by the house or shackled to the ring. That someone arrived in 1878, a scholar, soldier, and novelist named Lew Wallace. He came wearing the authority of Washington and the burden of expectation. To the territory, he was salvation on horseback. To the men who profited from chaos, he was a problem that needed managing. Governor Lew Wallace stepped into New Mexico like a man entering a gunfight with a Bible in one hand and a pardon in the other. He believed in law, but he also believed in redemption. And in trying to bring both, he'd find himself tangled in the same web of deceit, violence, and politics that had consumed everyone before him. The charge? Restoration of order, redemption through law, and the impossible task of taming corruption with conscience. When Governor Lew Wallace arrived in New Mexico Territory in 1878, the land was less a governed region than a wound that refused to close. The Lincoln County War had shattered faith in authority, and every man with a gun or a badge seemed to serve someone's wallet. Wallace wasn't a local power broker. He wasn't a Santa Fe ring lawyer or a politician with debts to pay. He was something far rarer, a man who believed peace could be negotiated rather than imposed. And in that belief, he walked straight into one of the most corrupt systems in American history. Born in 1827 in Indiana, Wallace was already a man of accomplishment long before New Mexico. He fought in the Civil War, commanded at Fort Donelson, and bought precious hours at Montgomery, delaying a Confederate assault long enough to save Washington itself. He was a general, a lawyer, a statesman, and later the author of Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, the novel that would outlive him by generations. Yep.
I did not know that.
Yep, sure enough. But when he accepted the governorship of New Mexico Territory, he entered a war without sides and a battlefield without honor. The Santa Fe ring owned the courts, the House owned Lincoln County, and the U.S. Army, still stinging from scandal under Colonel Nathan Dudley, had lost the public's trust entirely. Wallace's mission was not just to end the bloodshed, it was to resurrect belief in the law itself. He began with amnesty, a sweeping pardon for nearly all participants in the Lincoln County War, meant to draw a line under the violence. Let the dead bury the dead, he wrote, hoping to coax both sides back towards civilization. He traveled to Lincoln personally, among burned homes and blackened adobe, to speak with citizens, gunmen, and shopkeepers alike. His message was simple: the law has returned. But the frontier wasn't built for simple messages. By early 1879, Wallace met with William H. Bonney, also known as Billy the Kid. The young outlaw offered a trade: his testimony against the murderers of Attorney Huston Chapman in exchange for a full pardon. Wallace agreed. It was a rare moment where justice and desperation shook hands. Billy kept his word. Wallace didn't, or at least couldn't. Political pressure, power of the ring, and Washington's scrutiny made honoring the deal dangerous. The Kid was left betrayed, and Wallace, despite his efforts, would carry that moral wound for the rest of his life. Still, Wallace's governorship brought something Lincoln hadn't seen in years: a fragile calm. The open war ended, the bodies stopped piling up, but the men who had caused it, Murphy, Dolan, Rynerson, and the ring's lawyers, remained untouched. The soldiers were gone, but the system endured. Wallace called out the corruption publicly. He criticized the territorial courts, the manipulation of land grants, and the political greed that defined the ring's empire, but he could not uproot it. The men he opposed weren't gunfighters. They were landowners, judges, and senators. You couldn't shoot corruption when it wore a three-piece suit. After New Mexico, Wallace's story took a quieter turn. He became U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, where he impressed Sultan Abdul Hamid II with his intellect and diplomacy. He returned home to a gentler life, writing, lecturing, and watching Ben-Hur turn him from soldier to literary legend. But in New Mexico, his memory is mixed. To some, he was a soldier who saved the territory, a voice of reason in a lawless land. To others, he was just another idealist who thought he could reason with wolves. Lew Wallace didn't conquer the Lincoln County War. He ended it by wearing it down. He proved that sometimes peace doesn't arrive with victory, but with exhaustion. He was both the man who tamed the territory and the man who broke a promise to its most famous outlaw. The verdict of time? Governor Lew Wallace stands neither condemned nor absolved. He is remembered instead as the man who faced chaos with a pen instead of a pistol and learned that in New Mexico, the line between outlaw and official was written in disappearing ink. The powerful men of the Lincoln County War, the Murphys, the Dolans, the Catron lawyers, and the ring politicians, wrote their names in ledgers and law books, but the real work, the dirty work, was done by others. While the courtroom conspirators drew the lines, these were the men who crossed them. They were not generals or governors, they were enforcers, hired guns, drifters, and opportunists, the boots on the ground for the house. Names that never made the history books, but stained plenty of pages in Lincoln County's coroner records. James Longwell, Jake Owens, Inyardo, the surname lost to time, Thomas Cochran, Dick Lloyd, Jimmy McDaniels, Jim Wallace, R.L. Bryan, Roscoe Rustling Bob Bryant, we talked about him, John Chambers, Caleb Hall, Edward Hart, John Irving, a man known only as Prince, John Thornton, Buck Waters, and one Saunders whose first name history forgot. They came for money, for loyalty, or for the chance to kill with the law on their side. Some wore deputy badges, others just borrowed them for the day. Together, they made up the shadow army that kept the house standing when its walls should have collapsed. They guarded Murphy's stores, rode with Dolan's wrestlers, ambushed regulators on the open plain, and hunted men in the name of justice that wasn't justice at all. They were ghosts of a war without uniforms, men who slipped between outlaw and official depending on who was paying that week. Most of them died the way that they lived, quietly, violently, and unremembered. Their stories are scattered in newspaper clippings, forgotten graves, and witness depositions that read like obituaries waiting to happen. But together, they form the backbone of the house's muscle, the nameless hands that made corruption move. Now we turn our attention to them. Not the men in suits, but the ones in saddle dust and gunsmoke, the forgotten enforcers of the house, who proved that power on the frontier didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it just carried one long enough to get paid. The charge? To serve the power behind the badge, to enforce the house's will through gunfire, intimidation, and the quiet efficiency of men paid to make others disappear. When history remembers the Lincoln County War, it tends to speak the names that made the headlines: Murphy, Dolan, Riley, Catron, Wallace, and Billy the Kid. But for every man who stood behind a counter or a courtroom bench, there were 10 more behind a rifle sight. They were the unrecorded hands of the Murphy-Dolan faction, ranchers, drifters, rustlers, and hired guns who did the dirty work of empire for wages that couldn't buy a new horse. These were the men who filled out the ranks of Sheriff George Pepin's posse, the Severn Rivers Warriors, and Dolan's makeshift army when the county fell into open war. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't sign contracts. Their loyalty lasted only as long as the next payday or until the shooting stopped. There was James Longwell, the small rancher who rode with Dolan's men more out of survival than belief. Jake Owens, the Seven Rivers drifter whose rifle kept watch over Lincoln's burning streets, and Eduardo, a local vaquero whose surname history never bothered to write down. Thomas Cochran ran messages through the crossfire. Dick Lloyd played cards one night and rode for blood the next. Jimmy McDaniels was there at the Fritz Ranch fight. Jim Wallace and R.L. Bryan manned the barricades when Pepin's deputies surrounded McSween's burning home. And then there's the ones whose names sounded like they were born from the dime store novel pages. Roscoe Wrestling Bob Bryant, the horse thief turned hired gun, said to have met his end in a saloon fight that same year. John Chambers, the teamster who hauled water and ammunition through smoke and gunfire. Caleb Hall, the carpenter who built Dolan's barricades from the splinters of other men's homes. Edward Hart, John Irving, and a man called Prince, whose full name history never unfinished. John Thornton, the courier running messages between Lincoln and Fort Stanton. Buck Waters, the sharpshooter whose nickname was all anyone remembered. And Sanders, perhaps one of two brothers who traded cattle work for gun work when the pay was right. Together, they were the gears in the house's machine, expendable parts that kept the corruption turning. They burned ranches, guarded convoys, and turned open range into a killing field, while the men in suits in Santa Fe counted profits and called it law. Most of them vanished as quickly as they came. No obituaries, no gravestones, no justice. Just names scratched in deposition notes and payroll ledgers, ghosts of a war that history itself tried to forget. The verdict of time? They were not heroes. They were not legends. They were survivors of a corrupt system that rewarded loyalty with guilt and paid silence in silver. Their lives remind us that behind every empire, no matter how small or how local, there are always men willing to trade conscience for coin. The house's hired guns may have carried rifles and grudges, but another group carried something even more dangerous, a badge. These were the men who blurred the line between lawman and gunman, between protector and predator. They were the faceless mercenaries hiding behind smoke and saloon doors. They were the ones who could point to the star on their chest and say they were serving justice, when in truth, they were serving the house. From Deputy Jose Chavez Ibaka, whose authority came from the very system that fueled the war, to Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford, the sharpshooter who turned the high ground above Lincoln into his personal perch of death. From John Hurley and John Wallace Ollinger, men who rode under the pretense of law but acted under orders from Dolan's pocket, to lesser-known figures like Milo Pierce, Joe Nash, and Jim Reese. Those names flicker through court records like embers from the county's final fires. Even bureaucrats and businessmen played their part. T.G. Christie, who issued orders from behind a desk, Pantaleon and Lucia Montoya, local men whose allegiances kept the war supplied and the house's influence entrenched. Ramon Montoya, who stood watch as Lincoln burned, and Saturnino Baca, who literally fed the siege, supplying Dolan's men holed up in the Torreon as bullets and flames tore the town apart. They were the respectable face of corruption, the lawmen who swore oaths to order but delivered chaos instead. Their badges gave the illusion of legitimacy to what was, in truth, a private war disguised as justice. These were the other soldiers of the house, the ones history can't decide how to label. Not outlaws, not heroes, just men caught between the letter of the law and the price of loyalty. Now we turn to them, the deputies, the suppliers, and the loyalists who turned the sheriff's badge into a brand of allegiance, the ones who proved that in Lincoln County, the law didn't keep the peace, it picked a side. The charge? To uphold the house's power in its dying days through the borrowed authority of badges, borrowed bullets, and borrowed loyalty. As the smoke of Lincoln County War thickened in the summer of 1878, the House no longer ruled from behind counters or courtroom benches. Its power had retreated to the barricades, the Torreon, and the burned-out heart of Lincoln itself. This was the House's final army, a blend of lawmen, settlers, and hired allies, drawn from both Anglo and Hispano communities, held together by money, debt, and desperation. The badges they wore gave the illusion of order, but their oaths had long since been bought. Deputy Jose Chavez Ibaca was the interpreter, the bridge between the house's command and the Hispanic fighters it relied on. Fluent in the language of both law and loyalty, he patrolled between Lincoln and Fort Stanton, keeping the house connected and the regulators isolated. John Hurley and John Wallace Ollinger, brothers to the famous Bob Ollinger, held the outer defenses. Hurley vanished after the war, but Ollinger lived on, carrying the ghost of his brother's reputation like a shadow he never escaped. Milo Pierce, Joe Nash, and Jim Reese were the nameless backbone, the ranch hands and rustlers who became soldiers because their debts demanded it. They manned corners, courtyards, and killing zones, and then disappeared back into the dust when it was done. Behind the rifle stood T.J. Christie, a store clerk turned quartermaster, and Pantaleon Gallegos, the local merchant who supplied Pepin's men with rations, bullets, and hoped that someone was still paying attention. Then there were the Montoyas, Lucio and Ramon, the cousins, brothers, or maybe just comrades whose rifles never stopped cracking from the ridge until a fire at the McSween house lit the night sky. One was hit, the other lived to tell, but both helped turn Lincoln's adobe walls into a battlefield. And in the shadows, there was Santurnio Baca, the supplier of the siege. While others fought, he fed the war, sneaking water and provisions to Dolan's men barricaded in the Torreon. His role was quiet, practical, and essential. Without men like Baca, the house would have starved long before it burned. Together, these men formed the last flickering defense of the house, an uneasy coalition of power and survival. They fought not for cause of glory, but because the merchants, judges, and soldiers of Santa Fe had woven them into a system that made loyalty the only currency that's spent. They were the last men to fight under the house's flag, the last to believe its power might endure, and the last to stand in the ashes when it fell. The verdict of time? When the smoke cleared over Lincoln, history forgot most of their names. Their loyalties dissolved, their debts faded, and their badges turned to rust. But for 5 bloody days in July of 1878, they were the law. And in Lincoln County, that meant they were also the war. When the dust of Lincoln streets began to settle, another kind of power stepped forward, the kind that rode in under orders instead of debt. These were not ranch hands, regulators, or store clerks. They were officers, agents, and intermediaries, men whose uniforms and titles gave the Lincoln County War an illusion of legitimacy long after it had rotted from within. From Fort Stanton to Santa Fe, they stood as the territorial government's last defense against total collapse. But make no mistake, many of them were not neutral. Some enforced peace with precision, others protected profit with the same discipline. Colonel Edward Hatch, commander of the District of New Mexico, wore the stars of federal authority, yet even he struggled to keep his officers neutral as the war dragged the army into local politics. There was Captain Pernington and Lieutenant Blair, men who executed orders with military efficiency but couldn't escape the gravity of corruption pulling from both sides of the conflict. Lieutenant Appel, a dutiful officer whose reports to Santa Fe painted the war as a civil disturbance, downplaying the private armies and the civilian deed. His paperwork sanitized what his soldiers couldn't stop. Then there was Charles Peck, an agent and administrator who served as the territorial government's bureaucratic hand in Lincoln. His loyalties stretched thin between duty, diplomacy, and survival in a county where both sides would gladly hang a messenger. And finally, Juan Patron, a man of conscience in a land that had forgotten the word, a local leader who tried to bridge the divide between Hispano settlers and Anglo power brokers. Patron sought reform through reason rather than blood. For his effort, he was silenced, assassinated before his ideals could outlive the men who feared them. These were the faces of the federal frontier, officers and officials who stood between Washington's law and Lincoln's chaos. But even the Army, with all its order and honor, couldn't cleanse what New Mexico's politics had become. The House still whispered in every courtroom, the rings still wrote the law, and every man with a uniform soon learned that in Lincoln County, the flag itself could be bought, just like everything else. Now let's turn to them, the officers, bureaucrats, and intermediaries whose duty collided with corruption, the final pieces of a power structure that made peace only after every profitable war had been fought. The charge? To preserve order while serving chaos, to uphold the law on paper while watching justice collapse in practice. When the smoke of Lincoln streets began to fade, the last phase of the conflict belonged not to the gunmen or the regulators, but to clerks, colonels, and careermen, the bureaucratic skeleton that kept the machinery of power standing long after its moral spine had broken. These were the men who managed the aftermath, the officers, attorneys, and administrators who signed their names to reports that would outlive the bodies buried in the dirt. Colonel Edward Hatch sat at the top of the chain of command. His orders clear, but his conscience divided. A disciplined Civil War veteran, Hatch commanded the District of New Mexico with every intention of maintaining peace, yet his restraint allowed the war to fester. By choosing inaction over intervention, he preserved his reputation but condemned Lincoln to its bloodiest summer. The colonel's dilemma became the Army's shame, proof that neutrality, when applied to injustice, can become complicity. Captain George Purnington, Hatch's subordinate, recorded the Army's every step in Lincoln, the dusty march, the standstill, and the retreat. His reports were immaculate, his conscience less so. Purnington's own words painted a portrait of military precision masking moral paralysis. He stood by the letter of neutrality, even when McSween's house burned within sight of his command. History remembers him not for bravery or for cruelty, but for his silence, the kind that keeps promotions safe and wars unacknowledged. Captain Thomas Blair carried the same weight in his orders, but less patience for politics. He refused to act without written authorization, a soldier's way of surviving bureaucratic chaos. But when that order never came, he stood idle while civilians screamed for help. To the townsfolk of Lincoln, Blair was the Army's face of indifference, a man who enforced peace by ensuring no one dared disturb it. To the War Department, he was a good officer who did exactly what he was told. Lieutenant Daniel Appel became the rare voice of balance. When others buried the truth in reports, Appel preserved it in ink. He recorded testimony from both sides, regulators and House alike, and quietly confirmed what Hatch and Dudley denied, that the Army had walked into Lincoln not as peacekeepers, but as silent witnesses to murder. His investigation was clinical, factual, and stripped of anger, but its restraints carried its own indictment. The truth, he implied, needed no outrage. It simply needed to be written down. District Attorney Charles Peck inherited the wreckage left behind Rynerson's corruption. He tried to restore the rule of law in a territory where the word justice had become little more than a political currency. The juries were bought, the witnesses dead or missing, and every piece of evidence pointed back to the men too powerful to prosecute. Peck was not corrupt. He was defeated. His courtroom became a graveyard for good intentions, where justice was pronounced dead with proper procedure. And then there was Juan Patron, merchant, legislator, reformer, and the conscience Lincoln County tried to forget. A Hispano leader of rare integrity, Patron sought harmony where others sought control. He pushed for fairness in trade, representation in governance, and accountability among both Anglo factions and native communities. For his efforts, he was rewarded with a bullet in 1884, a delayed echo of the war that refused to die. Patron's assassination wasn't a murder of politics. It was the murder of principle itself. The verdict of time? These men were not villains. Nor were they heroes. They were the machinery of a broken system, faithful servants of duty operating in a world where duty no longer meant right. Their signatures justified neutrality, their silence prolonged corruption, and their restraint allowed the House to finish what its gunmen had begun. History rarely remembers the men who filled out the reports or balanced the ledgers, but in Lincoln County, their paperwork was as deadly as any pistol. Their ink sealed fates, their silence became law. As the Lincoln County War staggered toward its bloody conclusion, the roar of gunfire gave way to quieter, steadier rhythms. The sound of commerce, of wagons and ledgers, of survival disguised as loyalty. The leaders of the House, Dolan, Riley, Pepin, had carved their legacies in the smoke of burned adobes and the ink of corrupted court orders. Behind them, moving in the half-light of the conflict, were the men who kept the machine turning when the bullets ran low and tempers ran high. These were the providers, the merchants and laborers who turned loyalty into logistics, feeding soldiers, hauling ammunition, and keeping the war alive long after the cause had curdled into profit. Among them were the Baca family of the Hondo Valley, Miguel and Juan Baca, kin to Saturnino Baca. While Saturnino coordinated provisions to the house's fighters barricaded inside the Torreon, Miguel and Juan drove supply wagons through the dust and the danger. They carried sacks of grain, water barrels, and cartridges under cover of darkness, risking straight gunfire and silent suspicion alike. When the war ended, it was these men who testified about the hidden arteries of the house's supply chain, how food and munitions flowed like contraband across the valley while the rest of Lincoln starved. And then there was John Scallion, a name easily missed in the footnotes but written between the lines of every receipt and requisition. Scallion served as clerk, trader, and go-between for Murphy and Dolan's operations, his pen keeping pace with their ambitions. He managed shipments, certified transactions, and ensured that the facade of legality never faltered, even as the war around him made a mockery of law itself. He never carried a gun, never rode with a posse, and yet men like Scallion helped the House endure longer than it should have. For every trigger pulled in Lincoln County, there was a ledger entry somewhere that made it possible, and his handwriting was often the one that balanced it. These were the final links in the House's chain, the men who proved that every war, even one fought with rifles and revolvers, depends on the quiet hands that count, carry, and conceal. Their loyalty wasn't to power or principle, it was to survival. And in Lincoln County, survival had always been the House's profitable business. The charge? To profit where others perished, to sustain the House not through violence, but through lifeblood of supply. Every war has its soldiers, but Lincoln County's also had its suppliers, families and traders who didn't pull triggers, yet still helped decide who lived, who starved, and who won. When the bullets ran low and the desert turned quiet, the outcome was dictated by those who owned the wagons, the storehouses, and the credit lines that made the House's siege possible. The Baca family of Lincoln County were among the most powerful Hispano ranching and merchant dynasties in the region, landholders whose roots reached back long before the Anglo-mercantile monopolies arrived. Their herds grazed the valleys near Lincoln and Fort Stanton, and their freight lines moved goods from settlement to settlement across southeastern New Mexico. When the Lincoln County War ignited, the Bacas found themselves caught in its path, too wealthy to be neutral, too pragmatic to be heroic. Saturnino Baca and his brothers Miguel and Juan turned their wagons into lifelines for the Murphy-Dolan faction. They delivered grain, water, and ammunition to the Torreon during the 5-day Battle of Lincoln, keeping Sheriff Pepin's besieged men alive while smoke rose from McSween's burning house. They didn't fight with rifles, but with ledgers and mule teams, turning a survival into commerce. The Bacas weren't loyalists. They were realists. In a county where alliances shifted faster than desert wind, siding with the house was a matter of self-preservation. The family's cooperation ensured their ranches remained untouched and their businesses prospered long after the gunfire stopped. When the dust settled, they were still standing, proof that power in Lincoln didn't always belong to the quickest draw, but to the shrewdest dealmaker. Then there was John Scallon, the clerk who crossed battle lines not out of conviction, but calculation. An Irish immigrant like Murphy and Dolan, Scallon began his frontier career behind John Tunstall's counter, tallying accounts for the men whose murder started it all. But after Tunstall fell, Scallon saw where the fortune favored him. He slipped quietly into Dolan's service, trading one employer for another, and kept the books while the war around him devoured everything else. Scallon became a small but vital cog in the machine that allowed the house to reclaim its assets. He tracked cattle transfers, balanced disputed accounts, and ensured the illusion of order survived amid the chaos. When the last gunman fled Lincoln, Scallon remained with his ink and receipts, quietly helping the house turn bloodshed into bookkeeping. The verdict of time? The extended Baca family and John Scallon remind us that wars are rarely won by the loudest voices or the fastest guns. They're won by those who keep the wagons rolling, the accounts balanced, and the powerful supplied. Their loyalty was neither moral nor ideological. It was transactional. And in the ruins of Lincoln County, that kind of loyalty was worth more than courage. When the house stood surrounded and starving, it was their grain that filled its men's hands. When the blood dried, it was their trade that restored its fortunes. And when history finally tallied the cost, their names were written not in headlines, but in margins, where power always prefers to keep its partners. When Billy the Kid first rode into Lincoln in 1877, the war had already begun. Just without the shooting, the county was a ticking clock wound tight by greed, corruption, and desperation. All it needed was one last spark. By the late 1870s, Lincoln County, New Mexico was less a frontier than a private empire. At its center stood a monopoly called the House, run by the three Irish immigrants who had mastered the art of turning opportunity into ownership: Murphy, Dolan, Riley. What began as a single store near Fort Stanton grew into domination. They owned the sheriff's badge, the judge's gavel, and through the Santa Fe ring, the governor's pen. In Lincoln County, to owe money was to surrender freedom. And in a land where justice had a price, those who couldn't pay were the first to bleed. So following this episode, now we've laid out all the players. Who knew it would take 4 episodes just to introduce all the freaking players? And there's still some I didn't include, like
You knew.
even more minor players. But, I think not doing that would leave everybody kind of confused about who the hell we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it's a huge injustice to the story to do what one of my favorite movies did, Young Guns, leave out, like,
What's your favorite one?
is one of my favorites. It's so freaking good. But,
No, I mean, but tell.
they leave out so many people. And of course they have to. You can't do this.
Do that.
But I think that for us to tell this story properly, we had to take this time and lay out everything, and really so everybody can understand just what a huge conglomerate this was. I mean, this was literally a war between two. I mean, it wasn't like this rancher got pissed off at that rancher.
Yeah.
It was like two armies going at each
Tiny
other.
group of people with a grudge.
So
Yeah.
So now we've introduced all the players. So in the next episode, we can actually get to telling the damn story finally.
You've told some story. I've learned some things.
Have you learned some things?
Yeah.
Good.
It'll all sink in when I re-listen to us, but
And we've got a lot more to come as we really get into the intricacies of the story. We've given some broad overshadowing of the whole thing. Now we get to dive into the details and find out all of the stuff. So, but just quick question. Like, where are you coming down on all this? Who's the good guys and who's the bad guys?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Them. They are. Yeah.
It's so funny that we're talking about one of, if not the most famous outlaw of the Old West. I mean, arguably, Billy the Kid tops all of them. Jesse James, Wyatt Earp.
How dare you?
And as far as infamy goes, I think he definitely does. And I think that I've told the story in the way that it really transpired, in that if Tunstall, if their side would have won, Billy the Kid would either have lived on in obscurity and we'd never know who he was, or we'd be talking about him in the reverence that we talk about Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and the saviors of the Wild West.
True story.
It's just really interesting that you have this guy that is really portrayed, even in Young Guns, as a psychopath that likes killing people.
Yeah.
And I don't really think he was. I think he really was somebody that was forced into a bad situation, and it was either draw a gun or die. So you draw a gun.
Yeah.
But as we tell the story, I'll be interested to see your perspective and if it agrees or disagrees with me. So there's a moment before every war, quiet enough that you could mistake it for peace. The air is still, the dust hangs heavy, and men convince themselves that everything will hold together just a little bit longer. That was Lincoln County in 1877, a town pretending that the storm wasn't already at its door. The names we've come to know, Murphy, Dolan, Riley, had already written the script. The House ruled through credit, corruption, and fear, its power sealed with ink and paid for in blood. Sheriff Brady wore its badge, the court spoke its language, even the governor's pen moved at its command. In a place where justice was for sale, law didn't protect the innocent, it just priced their suffering. But cracks were beginning to show. John Tunstall's arrival was more than business. It was hope in human form, a young Englishman daring to believe that decency could survive in a country built on debt and intimidation. He didn't ride in with an army. He came with books, cattle, and a vision that men didn't have to buy their freedom from the same hands that held them hostage. In a different time, maybe that would have been enough. Then came Billy, a wiry kid with a restless grin and a revolver that hadn't yet made him famous. When he found work with Tunstall, he found more than a paycheck. He found belonging. In the endless sprawl of the New Mexico desert, that can feel like salvation. But the thing about belonging is, it gives you something to lose. And in Lincoln County, losing was often fatal. By the time 1878 dawned, the lines were already drawn. The House controlled the courthouse and the coffers. The McSween-Tunstall faction had nothing but conviction and a few good men. The Army watched from Fort Stanton, pretending neutrality while feeding the wrong side. And the Santa Fe ring, those puppet masters in distant offices, counted their profits as the county bled. Lincoln wasn't just a town, it was a lesson, written in smoke and ledgers, about how quickly justice decays when men with power mistake greed for destiny. When Tunstall's horse stumbled to a stop that February morning, the first shot didn't just kill a man, it killed whatever faith Lincoln had left in the law. And in the void, something else was born, a boy with a gun and a cause. Billy the Kid didn't start the war. He simply refused to stand aside while the guilty wrote the history books. Over the next few episodes, we'll follow that transformation, the way loyalty hardened into vengeance, and how the fight for fairness turned into one of the bloodiest vendettas in frontier history. We've already met the regulators. We'll see the fire that consumed Lincoln and trace how an orphan with no home became a symbol no bullet could silence. Because every legend starts somewhere, and this one began the same way all tragedies do, with good men outnumbered and evil too confident to believe that it could ever fail. The stage is set, the players are in place. Next time, the war begins. And that's where we'll leave Lincoln tonight, balanced on the edge of a knife, The house still standing tall, Santa Fe ring pulling its strings from the Capitol, and a young man named Billy the Kid just about to take his first steps into legend. Before the smoke and the blood, before the ballads and dime novels, this was how it all began. A boy looking for a fair wage and a town that couldn't afford fairness. Next time, we follow him into the fire.
If you've been riding with us this far through the dust and the deceit of Lincoln County, don't forget to help others find the trail too. Hit that like button, leave us a 5-star review, and follow us or subscribe wherever you're listening. It's the best way to make sure more history buffs and armchair jurors can join this journey through the Old West.
You can also share this episode with friends, family, or anyone who still believes the frontier was just heroes and outlaws. The truth.
You can also follow us on Substack for research notes, maps, and the untold stories that didn't make the mic.
History doesn't rest, and neither do we. The more you like, review, and share, the louder these forgotten voices get, and the harder it becomes for time to bury them.
We'll be back soon with the next chapter in the Lincoln County War, when lawmen turned mercenaries, ranchers became soldiers, and the legend of Billy the Kid was born from smoke and betrayal.
Until then, remember this: the jury of history never adjourns.